Well, hi, friends. This is Matthew Sewell, and you're listening to episode 105 of the Popecast, a history of the papacy, the only podcast about popes where you'll find non-boring stories on the successors of St. Peter, and a reminder that all the world's problems have happened plenty of times before. Before we get going, another quick thanks to all those who have signed up recently to receive Today in Papal History, our other papal project, which can be found over on Substack. It's at popes.substack.com. Both of these projects, the Popecast and Today in Papal History, will always be free to listen to and to read. But of course, time is always the most precious commodity. So if you feel called to support our efforts here monetarily, whether you are a new listener or reader or have been listening or reading for a long time, the best way to support us is to do that over on Substack with a paid subscription. Once again, that's popes.substack.com. Well, the guy we're covering this week was nothing short of a prophet. He called out society's future ills decades before they actually happened and reigned as pope through the assassination of an American president, the sexual revolution, and a sweeping reform in the Catholic Church. And as of the date that we're recording this week marked his feast day. At Pope number 262, it's Pope St. Paul VI. Giovanni Battista Montini was born in 1897 in the Lombardy region of Italy. He was ordained a priest at age 22 and just 3 years later was called into service for the Vatican Secretariat of State, the church's diplomatic arm. He'd worked in Rome for the majority of his 30 years in service to that office, but for a short time early on, he was sent to Warsaw to work in the office of Poland's papal nunciature, a fancy word basically for the Pope's embassy, and the office of his ambassador, the apostolic nuncio. Montini eventually grew to become one of the closest advisors to Pope Pius XII, who was pope from 1939 to 1958. Montini served under Pius prior to the latter's election, and then he became that pope's co-secretary of state in 1944 at the height of World War II. And fun fact, when Pius himself was involved in a clandestine plot to kill Hitler, and if you don't believe me on that latter point, go check out the book, Church of Spies, the Pope's Secret War Against Hitler, which is linked in the show notes here. If you haven't read it, I read it a long time ago. I was just talking to our friend Marilis from a few weeks ago that we both are in need of rereading it because it is so good. I forget if the future Paul VI is mentioned in that book or not. But at any rate, leading up to and during the war, it was Montini who, at Pius XII's request, ran a special information office regarding prisoners of war and refugees. In the 8-year span, in fact, from 1939 to 1947, the office received almost 10 million requests for information and actually pushed out over 11 million replies. For his efforts, Montini was constantly attacked by Benito Mussolini's government, but was still staunchly defended by the Vatican. 10 years later, Pius named Montini the Archbishop of Milan, the largest diocese in Italy, and 4 years after that, Pius's death gave way to the election of one Angelo Roncalli, the man we now better know as St. John XXIII. A potential point of drama, which likely doesn't have any drama at all, and didn't faze Montini at any rate, was the Vatican Secretary of State and the Archbishop of Milan, for that matter, were both typically jobs that were rewarded with an elevation to cardinal if the man in the seat wasn't yet one. Rumor has it, though, Montini never actually got the red hat during Pius's tenure, by the way. But rumor has it that he'd been offered the promotion by Pius XII several years and maybe multiple times, but out of humility, simply declined the office. But good Pope John, however, must have insisted because he started passing out red hats soon after his election, and Montini was one of those made a cardinal in John's first consistory in 1958. Cardinal Montini became very close to this pope as he had been to Pius XII. He served John XXIII faithfully as the latter convened the Second Vatican Council, but at one point reportedly didn't think it was actually the greatest idea, saying once about the pope, quote, "This old boy does not know what a hornet's nest he is stirring up," end quote. Still, Montini was faithful to the Holy Father's efforts and was a key player in the council's success, leading the Central Preparatory Commission, moving into the Vatican during the council himself, and ultimately seeing the council to its conclusion after John's untimely death from stomach cancer in 1963. But prior to John the 23rd's death, it's thought that not only was Cardinal Montini seen as the most likely successor to John, but he was actually the Pope's own choice for the man to follow him in the chair of Peter. That wish came to fruition in the conclave of 1963 when, on the sixth ballot, the Archbishop of Milan was elected as the 261st successor to St. Peter. He would take the name Paul VI after St. Paul, giving a nod to the missionary efforts of the great saint at a time when the church was badly in need of what we now refer to as the new evangelization. And in fact, Paul VI is considered by most to be the founder of that through his apostolic exhortation Evangelii Nuntiandi in 1975. But right from the outset, 1963, Paul VI shirked many of the more formal trappings of the papacy. He was the last pope to receive a coronation, the photos of which, in my opinion, are absolutely epic. But even that, the coronation was substantially modified. The papal tiara, the thrice-crowned signature of the papal office for centuries, he donated to the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. And he ceased usage of the sedia gestatoria, the chair upon which the Pope was carried into and out of public events by, 10 or 12 manservants, whatever it was. Although that could have been just a casualty of modern technology, considering the Pope Mobile, for lack of a better term. And I know that the Pillar guys consider Pope Mobile to be a gauche term. So I apologize, but I digress. Paul continued to replace these sorts of ceremonial functions throughout his papacy in an effort to better humanize the papacy, and with an understanding that no longer was the Pope a leader of vast properties or great armies, as they had been in centuries past. It was the Pope's spiritual authority, chiefly as a servant of the servants of God, that would hold sway into the future for who knows how long. And that's continued to be true all the way up to our beloved Pope Leo XIV today. There were three other main things for which Pope Paul VI has become known for. First, he obviously reconvened and closed the Second Vatican Council. Canon law requires that any ecumenical council, that is a council of the whole church, of which there have only been 21 in the 2,000-year history of Catholicism, that it be suspended upon the death of a pope. After Paul VI was elected, he chose to see the work started by John the 23rd through to its natural conclusion, instead of just closing it entirely. With one of the four sessions of Vatican II under their belts, Paul oversaw the final three sessions in 1963, 64, and 65, when it finally concluded. And though he naturally oversaw the whole effort, these actions in particular, or three actions, in particular, stand out. He created a permanent synod of bishops, basically an advisory body for the Pope. He declared the Blessed Virgin Mary as Mother of the Church, which is a nod to Mary's presence at Pentecost. And actually, it was a title that Pope Francis has doubled down on throughout his papacy. And finally, he made a specific addition to Lumen Gentium, the council document in which the church explained how she sees herself on both the College of Bishops and a reiteration about the primacy of the Pope. The document in general was the one from the council on which Paul VI saw as the most vital, since it contained Paul's teaching on the universal call to holiness. So it's written in Lumen Gentium, quote, "All the faithful of Christ of whatever rank or status are called to the fullness of the Christian life and to the perfection of charity. By this holiness, as such a more human manner of living is promoted in this earthly society," end quote. And that in particular was to combat the very common assumption that, only priests or nuns are called to live lives of deep faith and holiness. And Paul VI in particular decided to make that very clear, that how untrue that was, how each person, each Christian, each Catholic, each person living technically is called to a life of holiness. But second, Paul VI traveled far and wide. That's another thing he's been known for. He earned the nickname the Pilgrim Pope, and being the first pontiff to visit 6 continents. He visited the Holy Land in 1964, which actually marked the first meeting between a pope and the Eastern Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople in centuries. He was the first pope to visit the Western Hemisphere when he came to New York City in 1965 and addressed the United Nations. In addition to visits to Uganda, Colombia, Portugal, which was for the 50th anniversary of the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima, and the Philippines as well, which, fun fact, he actually was the victim of an assassination attempt but no one knew until after his death. And lastly, Paul VI was a writer, and as it turned out, a prophet. For his writings, Paul VI published 7 encyclicals, which interestingly all came in the first 4 years of his 15-year papacy. Sorry, had to do quick math there. 3 of the 7 taught on the Blessed Mother. Mysterium Fidei in 1965 was a teaching on the Eucharist. Populorum Progressio in 1967 exhorted governments to ensure that they served all people and not just a select few. Sacerdotalis Caelibus, also in 1967, doubled down on the church's commitment to priestly celibacy at a time when it was under attack. And finally, Humanae Vitae in 1968, what many consider, I consider, Paul's masterpiece, addressed the value of human life, the nature of marriage, and included prophetic teachings on what would happen if the wider world accepted the use of artificial contraception. But more on that in a minute. Paul VI reigned as Pope until 1978, finishing up what really was a centuries-long effort to reform the Mass. That was completed in 1969, but fun fact, Pope Benedict XIV, I believe, in the 1700s, was the one who started that. So lest anyone think that the liturgical reforms started in the mid-20th century, they are sadly mistaken. So the Mass, the reform of the Mass in 1969, the church calendar was also reformed in 1970. Notably, Paul elevated one Karol Wojtyła, the future John Paul II, to cardinal in 1967, and Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, to cardinal in 1977. Paul grew ill in the summer of 1978 and died on August 6th in Castel Gandolfo, the papal summer residence. He's buried beneath St. Peter's Basilica in a simple tomb, which bears his name. Paul's confessor, the Jesuit Father Paolo Dezza, called Paul a man of great joy and wrote, quote, "If Paul VI was not a saint, when he was elected Pope, he became one during his pontificate. I was able to witness not only what energy and dedication he toiled for Christ and the church, but also and above all, how much he suffered for Christ and the church. I always admired not only his deep inner resignation, but also his constant abandonment to divine providence," end quote. Pope Paul's legacy is a rich one. I mean, depending on who you ask, some people scoff at Paul VI actually being a saint. I am not of that camp. I particularly love Paul VI, clearly, if you haven't noticed. But his legacy is, I guess complicated. Maybe there's been the fruits of the Second Vatican Council and the Mass Reforms. Although my childhood bishop, the late Bishop Robert Morlino of happy memory, likened the time after an ecumenical council as a person getting major surgery. So when a person gets major surgery, they have to wait to have solid food, to have the filet mignon, to have the biggie size fry. I think he was a large man. They have to wait for 3 to 5 days, right after major surgery. You have to drink your food through a straw. But he said when you do surgery on a major organization like the Catholic Church with 1 billion members, the quote unquote solid food is not realized for 30, 40, 50, 60 years in some cases. And we see that throughout the history of Catholicism after its ecumenical councils. And the Second Vatican Council was no different. So that's tied up in Paul VI's legacy, of course, but it's still a rich one. And I think that's inarguable. He was hailed as a very holy man, as a saint, virtually from the moment of his death. But time has shown him, as I mentioned a minute ago, to be a great prophet. His encyclical Humanae Vitae came at a time when the whole religious world was calling on the Catholic Church to rubber stamp artificial birth control as acceptable at that point only within the confines of marriage for couples who were trying to abstain from having children, to space children out. And after a meeting of all the world's religions, I believe, except Catholicism, they convened at the Lambeth Conference in the 1930s. All of those world religions decided that, all those present at least, decided that artificial contraception was acceptable in certain contexts. The Catholic Church from then on was kind of on the hot seat, more or less, to follow suit. So ultimately, Pope John the 23rd convened a commission of individuals from all corners of the world and all sorts of professional backgrounds. I think there was an American doctor and his wife maybe who were on that panel, but they were made up of doctors, married couples, clergy, lay people, all with the express purpose of investigating the issue and then making a recommendation to the Pope. The commission, to keep a very long story very short, I think took several years. They advised Pope Paul VI that the church should indeed endorse the use of artificial birth control. Paul took their recommendation, thanked them for their work, and then opted to put his response to paper. And the fruit of that thought was Humanae Vitae. And in it, the short 31-paragraph document, Paul gave his reasons why the church would in fact not be approving of its use now or ever. So after addressing the issue of population growth around the world, he started there. He spoke on the nature of marital love, used the word fecundity a lot. 5 points for anybody who's heard that word before they listened to this episode or read that document. And then he explained the commission's origins and the purpose. So Paul pulled precisely 0 punches in spelling out exactly what would happen. He kind of set the stage, and then he let everybody have it. He said exactly what would happen if the world continued on its present path of allowing the use of artificial contraception. Again, back then it was just in this very narrow context. So that brings us to today's quote as we wrap up this week's episode. I'll paste the link to the whole document on the newly renovated Vatican website. I'll paste that in the show notes. But let's go through the 17th paragraph of Humanae Vitae in particular. So here's the first. I think there are 4 prophecies in all, we could say. So here's the first one. Quote, responsible men can become more deeply convinced of the truth of the doctrine laid down by the church on this issue if they reflect on the consequences of methods and plans for artificial birth control. Sorry, I guess that's the intro. Here's prophecy number 1. Let them first consider how easily this course of action could open wide the way for marital infidelity and a general lowering of moral standards, end quote. Any disagreements to that sentence have to be absolutely unhinged. Right out of the gate, Paul VI, he all but prophesies the next 50, 60, 70 years. Can anyone argue that there's been, in that time, a general lowering of moral standards since 1968 or an increase in marital fidelity? I think not. Let's keep going. Quote, not much experience is needed to be fully aware of human weakness and to understand that human beings, and especially the young, who are so exposed to temptation, need incentives to keep the moral law. And it is an evil thing to make it easy for them to break that law, end quote. I don't know about you. I have 3 little boys at home, and if I left them to their devices, they'd be wailing on each other all day. A lot of times they still are. They'll do just about anything to push the boundaries that my wife and I give them. And that makes me think of the great image from G.K. Chesterton about kids not playing fully on a playground atop a great cliff. That is, until a fence was put around the whole perimeter. And so Pope Paul points out this very thing. Rules, particularly in the moral realm, are in place not to restrict our lives, but to allow us more freedom to flourish and live more fully as we were intended, which is to love our Creator above all things and to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's the second one. Here's prophecy number 3. Quote, another effect that gives cause for alarm is that a man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman, and disregarding her physical and emotional equilibrium, reduce her to being a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires, no longer considering her as his partner, whom he should surround with care and affection, end quote. Hard to argue that one too. Look no further than the prevalence of pornography in our culture today as one example. Birth control, obviously, of course, isn't the sole cause of that, but it certainly played a part, right? So that's prophecy number 3. And lastly, Paul's final prophecy. Quote, finally, careful consideration should be given to the danger of this power passing into the hands of those public authorities who care little for the precepts of the moral law. Who will blame a government which, in its attempt to resolve the problems affecting an entire country, resorts to the same measures as are regarded as lawful by married people in the solution of a particular family difficulty? Who will prevent public authorities from favoring those contraceptive methods which they consider more effective? Should they regard this as necessary, they may even impose their use on everyone. It could well happen, therefore, that when people, either individually or in family or social life, experience the inherent difficulties of the divine law and are determined to avoid them, they may give in to the hands of public authorities the power to intervene in the most personal and intimate responsibility of husband and wife. Consequently, unless we are willing that the responsibility of procreating life should be left to the arbitrary decision of men, we must accept that there are certain limits beyond which it is wrong to go to the power of man over his own body and its natural functions. Limits, let it be said, which no one, whether as a private individual or as a public authority, can lawfully exceed. These limits are expressly imposed because of the reverence, there's the word again, due to the whole human organism and its natural functions, end quote. Once again, this letter was written in 1968. That's 57 years ago for those keeping score at home. But it's like he's describing the very same cultural milieu in which we live. Well, anyway, that's it for this week. Just a reminder that if you like what you hear, please be sure to hit that subscribe button. If you're on YouTube, leave us a comment with what you liked most. If you're listening on iTunes and Spotify, leave us a rating and a review. You can, now Spotify allows you to rate and review and even comment on stuff now, or wherever you're listening to this. And we'd love to hear your feedback on what you think. And lastly, if you'd like to support the work we do here, as I mentioned at the top of the show, the best place to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber over at Today in Papal History, the link for which can be found in the description below in the show notes. And again, the show and the newsletter will always be free to readers/listeners, but time is very precious. So your gifts in that regard allow for more time to produce the show and write more posts on these forgotten corners of papal history. Well, that's it for this week. As we head out today, let us ask for the prayers of Pope St. Paul VI, that we can remember the reverence due to those persons we encounter on a daily basis, and that we never tire of speaking the truth in charity, even when it's unpopular. And above all, never forget, these are strange times we live in, but they're no stranger than in ages past. Until next time.